My dad bought this property back in 1964, and I just fell in love with the place. And my husband and I built our house here. How many people live in an area that was gouged out by a glacier 13,000 years ago, and now the salt water fills this trough, and the tides come and go, and the sea life is so abundant, and we are stewards, and if we can only let nature be, we will have this special place for many, 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 many years for our children's children, our animals, and I just feel such a joy of being able to be a part of it.
The beaches on Puget Sound have been forming over thousands of years. Waves erode the shoreline, they move sediment around, they create the habitats that we see in the shoreline today. All those processes still are going on today. We may not think about them except during a big storm, but those are the processes that form our shoreline and continue to maintain our shorelines. Most of the Sound is surrounded by coastal bluffs. These bluffs are features that have formed because of erosion over a very long period of time. Most of them are still eroding today, but they vary a great deal. Some of the bluffs are heavily vegetated. They don't erode very often. Other bluffs in other places may be high, steep, and may erode, and you may see landslides frequently. When erosion occurs, it often occurs as a landslide. Maybe a very small one, just dumping a few wheelbarrowfuls of material down on the beach. Or it may be a very large one that in some parts of the Sound may even bring houses with it. But when that material comes down, it brings sand, it brings gravel, it brings mud, it brings trees, and the waves begin to work on that material. They move that material away. They move the fine grain, the silts and the clays, they move offshore into deep water. The big stuff, the boulders, may stay put and never get moved by the waves. But the sand and the gravel gets moved back and forth along the shoreline by the waves, and eventually is what builds our beaches. Ironically, when we try to prevent erosion by building bulkheads and stabilizing bluffs, which makes sense if you're a property owner concerned about a stairway or about your house, we cut off that supply of material from the bluffs to the beach. And over time, we have stretches of shoreline where we think we're losing the beaches because we've lost that natural supply of sediment. The beaches on the Sound are made of sand and gravel that's been eroded from the bluffs or that's been delivered by streams. And probably the most characteristic thing about our beaches is that there's a mixture of sand and gravel. So whenever the waves come in on a high tide, they move that material around. They move it up the beach, they move it along the shoreline, and they'll move the sand and the gravel differently. So depending on the kind of storm or the stage of the tide, you may come out one day and find a beach that's largely sand, maybe a band of gravel along the upper edge of it. Other days you'll come out and the beach will look like it's all gravel. And that's characteristic of the change we see every time a storm comes in. We've seen how as sand and gravel gets moved by wave action along the beach, it can move it from one place, an eroding bluff for example, to someplace quite different, maybe miles away. In this case, we're sitting on a sand spit that's built across the mouth of a small stream. The spit itself is basically sort of a big pile of sand and gravel at the end of the conveyor belt, where that material has accumulated over a long period of time, and in this case it's actually cut off the mouth of the stream or deflected the mouth of the stream, creating a small estuary. Here at the park, we have a great example of the relationship between the erosion of the bluffs and the formation and the maintenance of this spit. The erosion over time, over geologic periods, built this spit, but by the early 1970s, it had started to erode, and it looked like that erosion was largely because of bulkheading that had cut off the supply of material to the beach. That erosion was actually dealt with by coming back in and actually adding material, adding beach sediment back to the beach artificially in order to maintain the spit, to keep it from breaching and affecting the estuary.
The near shore is a quite extensive zone. It's starting way out at the edge of where light can penetrate until it's hitting the bottom of the water. And that's where light can drive photosynthesis to allow things like algae and eelgrass to grow up from the bottom. And it's extending way up the hillside to the top of the bluff, or in the case of where fresh water is entering the shoreline, to the head of the tide, the head of the place where even the fresh water is going up and down with the tide. And the reason that's important is we're finding out as we study the nearshore processes that there's a lot of energy that's transferred between the water and the uplands and from the uplands on down to the beach. There's a transfer of materials like wood, like leaves that form detritus. Fresh water is coming down from the shoreline, and the saltwater nutrients from the critters that are being eaten by crows and gulls and things like that are being carried up into the uplands, and those nutrients are helping to support the trees there. So as we're looking at this zone of two very different communities between the freshwater dominated and terrestrial environment and the marine environment of Puget Sound, we're trying to define this area where there's a lot of flow of materials and energy between those two zones, and we're calling that the near shore. Here I am high up on the beach, but I'm still sitting in a big puddle of water, and you may not be able to see this, but the water's flowing by me from the uphill to the downhill. An important thing about Puget Sound beaches is that they're always bleeding fresh water. And all of the shoreline geology here that you heard Hugh Shipman talk about is kind of stacking up fresh water in the uplands and allowing it to bleed out into the beaches. That mixing of the fresh water along this shallow water edge of the salt water is creating a lower salinity zone. The salinity is the amount of salt dissolved in the water. We call that mix of fresh and salt water brackish water. Brackish water conditions are really important for a lot of animals living in the intertidal zone, especially young salmon. As they're migrating from freshwater to saltwater, they need to hang out in these intermediate salinity zones so that they can make the transition to be a saltwater creature as an adult. So I'm standing here, sitting here and actually being able to taste the water, and it's not quite fresh. I wouldn't want to drink a big glass of it, but it's considerably less salty than the water that's behind me in the bay. This upper intertidal area is a very important place biologically. The trees that are above us are obviously providing shade from their branches. As the wood falls down from the branches or from the trunks onto the beach, it's helping to create beach structure and that microclimate, the little places where fresh water and shade can be on the beach that help certain things get established. And there's a lot of terrestrial insects that we don't even realize that drop off of the leaves onto the beach all the time. There's some recent research about salmon migrating along the shoreline. We're finding a lot of terrestrial insects in their stomachs, and that means it's very important to maintain a forested shoreline. While this may not look too appetizing to you and me, all these dead things are mixing together in this upper intertidal zone, being coated with algae, being coated with fungus, being torn down into smaller and smaller pieces that we call detritus. Now, detritus is flowing out into Puget Sound and being processed by lots of other animals throughout the year, and it's probably as important of a food source as the phytoplankton and the zooplankton that are occurring out in the oceanic parts of the Sound. A really important thing as we're standing in this high intertidal zone is the interaction between wood and the sediments of the beaches. There's a large western red cedar tree, and it is leaning over onto the beach and will eventually fall onto the beach. This is a really important source of wood, and it does a number of things. It harbors lots of beach hoppers. As you turn over a piece of wood, you'll see that moister, cooler environment where the beach hoppers can hang out, and they're going to be taking the small piece of vegetation, the leaves and the algae, and turning it into detritus. And the wood is also going to move around on the beach and create small microclimate areas where other vegetation can take hold. So we're up here in the upper intertidal part of the beach, and the sandy consistency of this harbors a number of organisms that you don't see further down on the beach. For example, as I move algae off the beach, there's a number of little beach hoppers that are breaking this down into smaller particles. Those particles are sinking down into the sand, and they're helping the sand to retain moisture. There's several species of forage fish. The one that's going to use sandy soils like this for its spawning is the sand lance. And Pacific sand lance are going to come up here during a high tide. They're going to lay their eggs into the sand, and those eggs will incubate into the wet sand for about 2 weeks while the water level stays below this area. The moisture that's retained by the small bits of algae is going to be a perfect temperature and moisture for those eggs to incubate. In about 2 weeks, the high tide will come back to this level and the small fish will emerge from their eggs and then go out into the water. Sand lance are particularly susceptible to any disruptions of this upper intertidal zone. So as people do bulkheading along the shoreline and disrupt those natural sediment transport processes, this elevation and this slope and this particularly very narrow area for sand lance to spawn might disappear from the beach. Just a few feet above the beach from where we were with the sandy substrate, we have a mix of sand and gravel. This kind of pea-sized gravel is a spawning bed for the surf smelt. The surf smelt is a little bit larger fish than the sand lance. The surf smelt eggs are going to be sticky and they're going to stick in between the sand grains and kind of have sand and gravel grains all around them. So the sand lance and the surf smelt, specifically the surf smelt, are up in this highest part of the intertidal beach, need the shade of overhanging trees and the leaves that are dropping in to be able to support their spawning conditions. Now, as these young forage fish, the sand lance and the surf smelt, emerge, they're going to become a very important food source for migrating salmon that are going to be coming out of the rivers, moving along the shoreline looking for food, ducking into these low salinity areas near streams, and they're going to be feeding on forage fish juveniles. As those forage fish mature out into the sound, they'll become food for lots of other things too. As we're building along the shoreline, as we build bulkheads and we clear that native vegetation off the beach, we are reducing the amount of food, the amount of wood, and the amount of leaves for the detritus that gets ground up by these amphipods. Mudflats are more productive than people give them credit for. There's this diatom film. It's a single-celled plant that is really taking advantage of the sunlight hitting this dark surface, and it's very warm. And these single-celled plants can grow extremely fast and form a film, this kind of orangish brown film across the surface of the sand. It's a very important food source for all kinds of things that are living below the sand and over top of it. For example, the clams will bring in a suspension of both floating particles from the water column, and they'll also kind of vacuum up the surface with their siphons as they get this film into their bodies, and it's a good source of nourishment for them. Some of the neat things to do when you're along the beach is to turn over rocks and look at what's growing on the undersides. A lot of times the low tide is going to stress a lot of the animals on the beach, and they're going to seek shade and water, and there's usually water that's gathered in the pockets underneath the rock. But it's really important that after you've looked, that you roll those rocks back to where you found them and cover them back up. These are green shore crabs. There's a couple different species of shore crabs that live usually under rocks or around. Low tide usually has them hiding out so they can avoid the sun and the heat and the drying conditions of low tide. Once the tide water comes back over top of them, they go out and forage, and they'll eat algae, and they'll eat little bits of barnacles or whatever other dead meat might be laying around on the beach floor. Well, barnacles are a pretty common sight on most beaches. Barnacles will cement themselves when they're very young to a large or rock or even a small cobble. And the barnacles will spawn en masse, really filling the water column with lots of larvae, and it's a really important food source. Also, if you look at those feeding tentacles, the little arms that are coming out of the barnacle gathering food, just like another crab or a shrimp, they have to shed their shells in order to grow. I know it's really tempting when you're on the beach to pick up sand dollars, and I would say at Tulby State Park and a lot of places like it, this is $1 million beach. There's as many sand dollars as I've seen anywhere. It's very important when you're around sand dollars to step lightly on the beach and be careful where you are, because they're generally right underneath the sand, only a few inches. If you find a live one like this, which is all covered with these brown spines and little hairs, that you place him back on the beach, right side up, just like that, and he'll bury himself back in. If you want to collect a souvenir, there's plenty of